Last weekend, and from last week's talk, I ended up going around with my wife and ran into a garage sale. Here in, it was Bosque County's, countywide garage sales. And I ran into a set of these student handbooks. Now these are issued by Southwestern, but the fact is that they're authorized and all colleges use standard revisionist history and approve the material that goes into these student handbooks for their students. So that way they cover all kinds of different subjects, from marketing and economics to biology to physics to American history as well. So in there, and like I said, I picked up some, I scanned some things here. I'm going to make these available, for everybody, but I think y'all got copies of them right now. And it's called The Problem with Revisionist History. I just wanted to have this because, as someone here just mentioned a little earlier, it is great to actually prove the point. I could stand up here and tell you all kinds of things, but when you can see it for yourself, you believe it. And this is one of the things that I talk about on a radio show. When I give somebody some facts, I say, don't take it, for granted, but look it up. If you actually look it up and you start doing a little research yourself and you confirm and validate what I've said, it is even more important than what I say to you. It's more important that you validate it on your own, and then you go, wait a minute, this is right. So last week, we're kind of recapping some of the pre-declaration. We talked about the rights and how the founders were actually developing from a lot of social theory, from Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the social contract, which I'm going to touch on here in just a minute. We talked about the Declaration of Independence and how it evolved to come to be, because they had tried this blueprint that we're following right now to go ahead and free themselves from tyranny. And finally it came down to the point they had to declare independence. It was just the last option that they had. So we're going to touch on that, but last week I was talking about the fact, and I'm just going to go ahead and touch on this first because it confirms. You'll notice in here I say, these lies are being taught to our children to hide the true history of America's founding. As I mentioned last week, there is an old adage, and it turns to be absolutely true. History is written by the victors. Okay? Whoever wins determines how the history is written. So we have to dig through a lot of documents, a lot of references to find the truth, because they will leave a trail, and most of the times they don't realize they're leaving that trail. But here's another adage. It is easier to tell the truth because it's much harder to remember all the lies. Okay? It is much harder to remember those. So this is a perfect example of that. This student handbook, it was copyrighted in 1995, put out by Southwestern. And we see two problems arise just from something, and this is just in a brief glance at this book when I saw that it did things by the time period in American founding. So when I looked in there, it showed you the conflicting, and I said there's two things we're going to look at here. The conflicting dates of Virginia's ratification of the Constitution, which gives the appearance that the Constitution was easily and quickly ratified, and our country was like all of one mind and a federalist thought. Okay, that's the idea that is trying to be pushed on us. Second thing is something I mentioned last week that is kind of an oddity, a piece of trivia that normally wakes people up that, wait a minute, that doesn't sound right. But George Washington was inaugurated as our first president before the Constitution was actually ratified. So in this book, you'll see on page 60 that this is covering the period of time from 1785 to 1789. Okay? And in this book, you'll see all the dates in chronological order, and you'll see on the right column, 1787, December 7, Delaware became the first state to ratify the Constitution. Okay? So I just wanted to print these out so that you can kind of follow it. Then you see that on December 12th, Pennsylvania came in, New Jersey came in on December 18th. January 2nd of 1788, Georgia was ratified the Constitution, and this is with the Bill of Rights, by the way, to remind y'all. January 9th, Connecticut, 1788. Okay, so then we go to the next page, which is 61, and you can look at the bottom and see the page numbers. And you'll see that it goes down here and it says Massachusetts, Maryland, South Carolina, New Hampshire being June 21st. Now here's the kicker, and I've got it highlighted in yellow on this one. It says June 25th, 1788, Virginia ratified the Constitution and became the 10th state of the Union. Now, interestingly enough, and I mentioned last week, remember that they added Article 7 into the Constitution that made their decisions not have to be unanimous. So therefore, out of 13 colonies, they had to get 10 to ratify the Constitution. Now, it's kind of a sad state of affairs, as I mentioned last week too, that the fact is you're trying to say 13 sovereign nations, in effect, we're going to join together and actually become a union, a real union. Of course, we talked about the Articles of Confederation was a kind of a treaty between us that we're all going to work together. Very similar to the European Union, the way that it was originally intended. Okay, so to move into this, you would imagine you'd need unanimity. You need every one of those states, but they didn't. They added in this Article 7 that would make it, a majority vote. So in here, as they're teaching our college students, they're saying that Virginia ratified on June 25th, 1788. Okay? So we're looking at that, and I'm just going to step back real quick, because notice the first date was December 7th, 1787. So we're just kind of keep that in mind. End of 87 is when they actually got out there and they started ratifying. Now we look at that, and then we're going to skip a little further. We're going to come back to this page for this one point. And we're going to go from page 61 to 63, because there wasn't any ratifications in that period. They were talking about other things. But you'll see at this period of 1790 to 1794, okay? In the first entry paragraph, it's talking about, and I'll read the whole paragraph and I'm going to emphasize the end where I've got it highlighted in yellow. Probably the most important political event of this period was the adoption of the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. Okay, that's correct. Some had opposed adoption of the Constitution because of its lack of guarantees of such rights as freedoms of worship, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and freedom of assembly. Supporters of the Constitution had promised that if ratified, it would be amended in these respects. Okay, remember, everybody was opposed to it. They said, wait a minute, no, we're just not going to do this. Men like like Patrick Henry, George Mason, they were objecting vehemently. They said, wait a minute, the Constitution is going to give the central government way too much power. So that's why they promised that if it was ratified, it would be amended in these respects. Note that they didn't ratify without that being in there. So all of the states that had objected made the Constitutional or Continental Congress come together and wait until they were ratified before they could actually do it, even though they did it where it was going to be a majority vote. Okay, so it was, it'd be like this, and this is kind of hidden in here. You don't really notice it. The fact is that they said, well, we'll promise we're going to do this if you'll just go ahead and ratify the Constitution. Well, no, they're not going to do that. They're going to. It has to be in there before they're going to sign off and say, okay, we ratify. So they forced them to do that. Now that's in here. Now, but they never point this out. They never teach us in school. Wait a minute, no, this was an absolute. You had to have that Bill of Rights in there. Okay. Now it comes down here. It says, accordingly, on September 25th, 1789, Congress voted to submit the amendments to the states. Okay. Now remember, the first one was ratified in December of that year. Okay. And from there, they became part of the Constitution, and this is important, on December...
Right now?
On page 63.
Okay.
Yeah, you can see. Yeah, there you are. On page 63. So it says they became part of the Constitution on December 15th, 1791, when Virginia ratified them. Okay? 1791. Now, remember where we started off here? We started in 1789. So when I was talking about the fact that there was this massive argument by Virginia, and it was the last state to ratify, they made it the 10th state in our history books to ratify. Because that, and notice that kind of weird psychological deal. Virginia was the holdout. Otherwise, we wouldn't have had a constitution. And we almost didn't because of the 9th Amendment that they were arguing about for 2 years. So they turned around and they make it the state, you know, in this other date that would have been the 10th in there, the one that would actually be a majority and carry the Constitution ratified. So it says that Virginia ratified them, thereby completing the required number of state ratifications for passage into law. Now that's the key point here now, okay? So we also understand here. So you have to have this number of state ratifications passage into law. Well, if it did not ratify till then, okay, then was it ratified? No, it was not until this date. They waited until all 13 had actually ratified it. They made it a majority anyway. They said it was required with this way, but there was so much pushback that they decided, no, we're going to make all of them ratify. But since we're talking about December 15th, 1791, now we're going to step back a page to the one other entry, and something I mentioned last week is a point of trivia. And it says April 30th, 1789, George Washington, Federalist of Virginia, was inaugurated President of the United States. So therefore, George Washington, the Constitution was not even ratified. It was not even ratified at that point in time for him to become the president. Now, how is that? This is the obscurity. They don't tell us about this. As I was saying, the Articles of Confederation required an election of a president every year to manage the Articles of Confederation, the centralized work between all of the colonies. That bureaucratic, committee in effect. So John Hanson was our first president, actually, since the Revolutionary War. But here's George Washington, who was not even legally our president, because without the Constitution, we don't have a form of government. We don't have any of the branches. We don't have anything in place, and yet it's not ratified. He was not legal at that point in time, and they never came back and fixed it.